Hi, and welcome to our new series entitled A Way Apart, the parting of the ways between Christianity and Judaism. I'm very excited for this mini series because it's forced me to explore a part of Judaism I knew very little about, namely the period after the close of Tanakh and before the publication of the Mishnah. I was familiar with the books of the Maccabees and a few other odds and ends, but to me, as I'm sure many other Orthodox Jews, this time period is historically vague and halachically opaque. The question that drives our whole discussion is this. Christianity spouted from Judaism, right? So, how exactly did that work from a halachic perspective? Let's put it in extreme terms. Was Sruly a good halachic Jew one day, and then after he decides to believe in Christianity, he is suddenly a guy the next day? If not, then what happened? So, this week we explore a bunch of background information before we can even attempt to answer that question. Things like who are the stakeholders during this time period? There's Jews, there's Romans, there's Christians, the People's Front of Judea, but who else? We discuss the halachic issue or lack thereof in using the name Jesus, because otherwise everything gets awkward in trying to avoid it, and what he and his followers believed. We talk about the text and what will be our sources for information from that time, like the Roman historian Tacitus and the Jewish historian Yosef ben Matisyahu, better known as Flavius Josephus, and much more. Lastly, a word of caution. My goal here is to explore the history of halacha and how it intersects with Christianity. I am 100% in no way advocating for any adoption of Christianity by Jews. In fact, just the opposite. I want to state unequivocally that Christianity is not for Jews in any way, shape, or form. If there are any Christians listening to this podcast, I encourage you to support Jews and Jewish causes whenever possible and to adhere to the 7 no-hide laws. I believe it's important for Jews and Christians to live together harmoniously, and I'm grateful for the support and changing attitudes of the church towards Judaism over the last 70 years. May it only continue. And now, without further ado.
Okay, and now for something completely different. Welcome to A Way Apart, the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. I highly recommend, if you haven't seen it before, watching The Life of Brian, especially the scene with the People's Front of Judea. Let's start with the introduction. In the Second Temple, what we're going to call Bayit Sheni, there were, I guess we can describe it as a cornucopia of religious factions. There are the Sadducees, the Baitusim. I know that Chazal sort of explain the origin of these groups in kind of an implausible way that there's Tzadok and Baitos who misunderstood their teacher, Antigonus Ish Socho. You might remember him from Pirkei Avos. Antigonus is Antigonius. Um, there's more about how they misunderstood his saying of that you should be ketalmidim hamashamshim sarav almanas shelo almanas lakabel pras. You can see Avos de Rabbi Nosson for more on that, but the explanation um, that the Tzedukim at least came from the followers of Tzadok, who was the Kohen Gadol. That's to be preferred. I would direct you to the entry in the Jewish Encyclopedia for more. Anyway, there are in the time of Beit Sheni Tzedukim, Baitusim, Essenes, whatever the Dead Sea Scroll community was. There are the Sikari. I know it sounds like I'm just making up words at this point, but these are probably a legitimate group. It comes from the Sikari is Latin for knife or dagger. These are a group that sometimes you'll see referred to as the Zealots, especially now in the period of the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av. That group is very well known for the Gemara regarding the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. But there's more. There are Samaritans, and of course, there's us, the People's Front of the Pharisees, or the inheritors of the Pharisees. We'll talk about who the Pharisees were. They're essentially the forerunners to Chazal. But as if that wasn't enough, now towards the end of Bayesheni in or around the turn of the first century, we start dealing with a new group who are called the Nazareans, i.e., they are the people who follow the guy that came from Nazareth, not the Nizirim, the people who are Nazareth, who, yeah, I guess we'll say they are Nazarites, not those people, and also not the guy from Beis Lechem. We'll talk about the differences over there. But these are the people who, as Monty Python would say, are the ones who bless the cheesemakers. Fair warning, there's going to be a lot of Monty Python references. Okay, here's the problem. At what point do two branches of a single religion shift to become two different religions? This is, of course, a historical and an ethnographic question, but more importantly to us, it is a halachic question. At what point, either in time or in terms of belief and practice, did Christianity stop being a part of Judaism from the standpoint of halacha? And I know that even using the term Christianity is a little bit of a misnomer because at that point, around the end of the first century, the Common Era, it's not monolithic. There's different factions like the Ecclesiates. We're going to just lump everything together and pretend we're talking kind of post Constantine. Okay, a few disclaimers over here. First of all, I want to be 100% clear on this point. I do not personally believe or support the belief in Jesus or any Christian doctrine whatsoever, nor do I support or encourage Jews to believe or even consider believing in any Christian doctrine whatsoever. I am not a halachist, so I can't tell you if it's avodah zarah or kfira, but I can tell you it's not for Jews. If Christians want to believe, I'm not going to comment on that one way or another. Now let's do a brief aside on the name Jesus. So, number one, halacha is pretty clear. You're not supposed to use the name of idolatry. But number two, you can say the name of idolatry that's no longer idolized. So Dagon or Baal Peor, or you can say things like Nike or Memphis or Mazda, right? All of those are names of idolatry that is no longer practiced. So what about Jesus? Well, I think we can all agree that that wasn't actually his name for starters. The Gemara explicitly refers to him as Yeshu, which is either short for the good Jewish name Yoshua, or perhaps it's an abbreviation of Yimach Shemo V'Zichro. But bottom line, using the name Jesus is perfectly halachically acceptable as far as I know. Christ or Christos just means anointed with oil. Okay, let's do a little bit more background. So, fair warning, I am not an expert on either the topic of the history of halacha or on Christianity by any means. I'm going to be providing my understanding of the sources based on my limited research. Uh, you all can feel free to send me questions, stump me, share insights if you know better. Here's what I believe you need to know in order to formulate a coherent halachic picture of the events in the time that we're talking about. We're saying towards the end of Bayit Sheni, the first century of the Common Era. Here are some of the things that I think we need to know and are fundamental for the continuing conversation. Number one, Jesus was a Jew. In fact, he was the first person historically that we know of who was referred to as a rabbi, and I mean a lot. So there are examples in Matthew 23, 7 and 8, in Mark 9, 5, in John 1, 38 and 49. Actually, it gets kind of interesting because if you go to Matthew 9, 18 through 21, you get to see that Jesus was actually wearing tzitzis. There, it talks about this woman who grabs onto the fringes of his garment. The word in Greek there is kraspedou. You see the word in Greek. You can basically read it. It almost looks like English. Um, kraspedou essentially means fringes or tassels. So she's grabbing onto Jesus's tzitzis. Jesus is a good halachic Jew. He wears talis and tefillin. He's referred to as a rabbi. He was born and lived and died as a Jew. What sect or denomination he may have belonged to is controversial. I've heard everything from Pharisees. Remember, this is kind of the group that is the forerunner to Chazal. So I've heard that he was part of the Pharisees or the Essenes or maybe even the Sikari. One thing is for sure, he's definitely not a Sadducee because they apparently don't believe in resurrection, and that was kind of his thing. But in the end, it's probably irrelevant. Jesus was born, lived, and died as a Jew. Jesus' students were all Jews, like normal from Jews. Okay, so he has one student, Simon Shimon, who was a zealot, but the rest are, we'll call them Pharisaic Jews. After Jesus, the most important person of what we will call for now the Jesus movement was a Jew who never met Jesus but believed in him and wanted everyone else to believe as well. That man's name was Paul. All these names, Paul, John, Peter, these are all anglicized names. Paul is Shaul, Shaul of Tarsus, lives from born, let's say, around the year 5 and dies around the year 65 of the Common Era. Tarsus is Tarshish, probably near Antioch. The question as to what kind of Jew Paul was and where his belief system came from is an entire discipline that we're going to summarize in like 2 sentences, Pache E.P. Sanders, by saying that Paul's beliefs moved over time and across his writings along a spectrum and may have started as what we'll call, to use a more technical term, nomian, meaning in line with the law, or nomos. Um, so it fits within the bounds of acceptable Jewish belief and practice of his day, and I think seems to have moved over time to become more antinomian or outside the bounds of what is accepted as normal Judaism for his time. Whether or not that takes him out of Judaism entirely is going to be a whole discussion that we'll try to get to. Yes, Jesus probably believed that he was a prophet who was helping to usher in the eschaton, the end of days, the Mos HaMashiach. And Paul probably likewise believed that the Messianic age had to start with the non-Jews. He tried to go to the Jews, didn't get quite a great reception over there, and so he went to the non-Jews and said, look, I can essentially get you into Judaism, get you to the Mos HaMashiach all at kind of a discount, and that was very well embraced. But the point that is important for us to remember is that all of this is pre-Rambam, pre-Maimonidean. So the Rambam has his 13 element attributes of faith, the Yud Gimel, Ikre, Emuna. All of that post dates our entire discussion. So during the time that we're discussing, you can still be a halachic Jew, meaning you can keep Shabbos and kashrus, and no one's going to bat an eyelash if your beliefs are not in line with those that Rambam mandates. Just because someone, let's say, doesn't believe in resurrection like the Sadducees, doesn't mean they are not a halachic Jew. Meaning, can you count them for a minyan? If they give a young lady a shava pruta and say hareat mekudeshesli, and she accepts it, does she need a bill of divorce? If they touch your wine, is your wine yayin nesach? All of those things are halachic demarcations. They're points where we say someone is on one side or the other of the halachic fence. Are they a goy or a Jew? And belief in things that would put you outside the pale post Rambam are not problematic pre Rambam, certainly in the first century of the Common Era. In terms of Jesus, especially, it seems clear to me that his message was as much or possibly more political than religious. That's the reason for Rome to crucify him. Crucifixion was, I mean, mainly reserved for people who are involved in sedition, people who are revolting against the government. The government wants to make a public display of their death, and that's what a crucifixion was. The crucifixion did not happen in Yerushalayim, because, as the pasuk tells us, Yerushalayim harim saviv la, you can't see what's going on. Rather, they used to crucify people on the road, so that every stop there's another person crucified, and it's a very long drawn out process, unfortunately, and all of that is done as a spectacle to show that this is what happens if you rebel against Rome. The Jews were constantly oppressed by Rome, and they were waiting for a Moshiach, i.e., an anointed king, not a Moshiach, a Messiah, who can lead them. They want the king to lead them to fight back. And that's exactly what they did in around the year 66, and that led to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. They did it again in the early 130s. That's the Bar Kokhba revolt. We'll talk about all of those a little bit more in depth. Besides Paul, other apostles are just the Talmidim, the students of Jesus. Um, they're the messengers, apostles, like postal to send out a message. And the message that they send out is the evangelion, what becomes the Gospels. But evangelion, evangelize, is the good word. So the apostles spread the good word, which is the word of Jesus. So the other apostles held different views. James wanted to keep the mitzvos, and Peter, who's also referred to as Kephas, which essentially means rock, or like Selah, was somewhere in between. Paul won the day, meaning Christianity sort of followed his approach because he was super successful at growing the movement. When he went out to the Goyim, they it was there's a much bigger audience and they embraced it. We're going to ignore the very interesting, but to my mind, unfruitful conversation as to whether or not Jesus was a Pharisee or an Essene, maybe something else. There's no real scholarly consensus there. And secondly, there's too many contradictory indications in the Gospels to pin it down. Maybe it goes without saying, but neither Jews nor Christians believe that the Gospels were written by prophets, right? So there can be, and there are, contradictions between the Gospels. We're going to talk about the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels because there's a synopsis of the life of Jesus when you look through all three of them. So even though there may be contradictions between one to the other, and we're going to ignore the theory of Markan priority, but when you take those three gospels together, you get a good synopsis of the life of Jesus. John's gospel is canonical, but there's some stuff there that's a little bit far fetched. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit more. There are gospels that are not canonical, that are outside the canon. One really interesting one is the Gospel of Judas. So you might know that Judas is the one who betrays Jesus. If you read the Gospel of Judas, which is again not part of the Christian canon, it's essentially, spoiler alert, the whole plot of the sixth book of Harry Potter. Right? Snape kills Dumbledore, and we find out that Snape had to kill Dumbledore. He wasn't the enemy. He was actually doing it for a good reason. And that's the same thing with the Gospel of Judas, where it turns Judas from being the enemy to actually someone who had to kill Jesus, because Jesus has to die in order to forgive everybody's sins. So it kind of rehabilitates him. But again, we're going to deal just with the canonical Gospels. The most common way to tell the story is that during and especially after Jesus' lifetime, there were many different groups who had varying opinions on Jesus' status, the importance of keeping the mitzvos, and what to do with the movement. Maybe some of this was influenced by the philosophy of the Dead Sea sect. We mentioned them a little bit earlier. They had an expectation, at least some of them, of the return of this guy who was referred to as the teacher of righteousness. Maybe that's kind of a prelude to the resurrection of Jesus, maybe not. In the end, Paul decides to take Jesus' message or his version of that to the Goyim, essentially allow them to be a part of the movement, even without real conversion, as long as they go through kind of a partial conversion. So we have mikvah, they call it being baptized, and rather than having to go through mila, circumcision, they just have to circumcise their hearts, which doesn't involve any actual circumcision. You can see more about that in Romans 2:28 and 29. Um, just, I guess, a little bit more to orient us. So in Yiddishkeit, you have Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. There are other books that are Jewish books, but are not within the canon of Tanakh. So you have books like Tobit or Tuvia. The Maccabees, the books of the Maccabees are not part of the Jewish canon. Ben Sira is not part of the Jewish canon. So those are all lumped into things that are known as the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha. And then you get other books like Jubilees that are not even in there, but these are other books that are written and are Jewish stories, but are not part of Tanakh. Then you get what I'm going to try to be consistent in referring to as the Christian Testament. So, according to Christianity, they believe in the canonicity, the authenticity of Tanakh, and of, I would say, large swaths of the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha have some value to them. They're part of the reason that those books are even preserved, but then they have their own books. Like I mentioned, the Gospels, but then there's other books. There's Romans, there's Galatians, there's all these various letters that Paul sends to different people. All of that makes up the Christian Testament. And then there are books that are even outside of the Christian Testament. That's what I was mentioning earlier, like the Gospel of Judas. Okay, so what do we got so far? Um, there's lots of Jewish sects. The Jesus group wasn't hugely different than any other. I mean, we can call them from groups, but any other group that is still halachically part of Judaism at the time, certainly up until Paul. So we're left with our question of when did followers of Jesus stop being halachic Jews? Okay, so let's try to put some bookends on this. Definitely by the mid to late 300s of the Common Era. That's after Constantine converts and Rome essentially becomes Catholic. There's an understanding by all parties involved that Jews and Christians are different groups. So, who are the parties involved? I think we can break them down into four categories. Category number one are Jews who don't believe in Jesus. We're going to call them Stam Jews. This is actually the most complex bunch, but for now we're going to assume that all Jews are essentially Pharisaic, rabbinic. They practice what Malka Simkovich will call common Judaism. I know to be historically accurate, we would need to differentiate between the Pharisees and Chazal, but I don't think it matters all that much for what we're trying to understand. That's group number one. Group number two are Jews who believe in Jesus, Jewish Christians. Group number three, we'll say starting with Peter, are non Jews who believe in Jesus. We'll call them Stam Christians. So we have Stam Jews, Jewish Christians, Stam Christians. And group number four are essentially Romans, non Jews who also don't believe in Jesus. Those are Stam Goyim. Okay, this period is known to historians as the parting of the ways. There's even a book, actually. There's lots of books, but the first is James Dunn's book that's entitled The Parting of the Ways Between Christianity and Judaism and Their Significance for the Character of Christianity. It's kind of important to remember that Christianity essentially dominates from the year 300 up through, I don't know, the 19th, maybe 20th centuries. So they get to write all the books. There as much Jewish studies as there are even today. There's 10 and 100-fold in terms of population. Christianity is so much larger than Judaism that there is much more written from the Christian perspective than there is from the Jewish perspective. But really, in terms of history, this metaphor of the parting of the ways, you can kind of picture a road that forks, and then there's two roads that diverge from there. That's actually a positive step because it replaced a previous analogy that saw Judaism and Christianity as a mother and daughter relationship. That metaphor of Judaism being the mother religion and Christianity being the daughter religion is essentially rooted in replacement theology or supersessionism. This is the idea in Christianity that Christians are the new Jews, that they superseded the Jewish people because the Jewish people didn't do what they were supposed to do, and so HaKadosh Baruch Hu kind of moved on from them to the new Jews, who would be the Christians. That's the mother-daughter analogy, which has now been replaced in historical thought with this parting of the ways. I think we can safely ignore there's a trend in academia when you run out of ways to kind of explore a topic. The next thing you have to do is deconstruct it or go in the exact opposite direction. You find this in art a lot of times, but in the study of Christian history and Jewish history, the same trend kind of takes place where you have this contrary position that's argued in works like The Ways That Never Parted. Um, the central argument there is that Jews and Christians continued to interact for hundreds of years, so they never really parted in the first place. I think that's a far cry from halachically including Christianity in Judaism, so we're not going to bother with any of that. Okay. Um, I think we were talking a little bit about the sources of our knowledge for this time, which are sparse, but let's just outline them so that we have a good sense of where we get the information that we're talking about. The first is the Dead Sea Scrolls. So these predate Christianity by several hundred years. Um, we can explore the theology that's espoused there a little bit. Some of it, I think, as we mentioned, is the forerunner or is what some of those in the Christian movement used as source material, or maybe it was just bouncing around in the ether. But there's information that we can find from the Dead Sea groups, or maybe the Essenes who were the Dead Sea. It's not 100% clear. Um, and scholars are still kind of arguing over this. But the bottom line is there's stuff that was espoused by these groups that left material at the Dead Sea that seems to be a forerunner, or could possibly be a forerunner, to some of the theology that starts to crop up in early Christianity. So Dead Sea Scrolls is one source of information for us. You might think that Philo would be another source. So Philo of Alexandria is a Jew who was born in the year 20 before the Common Era and died in the year 50 of the Common Era. So he overlaps Jesus chronologically, but he doesn't mention Jesus at all. This isn't necessarily super surprising, as in Jesus' lifetime, he didn't make the hugest splash, certainly outside of Eretz Yisrael. The church actually preserves Philo's writings because reading everything as allegory, which is essentially Philo's approach, that Avram and Sarah are actually representative of form and intellect, or whatever the whole approach to scripture, to Tanakh, as or at least the Chumash, as being highly allegorized. That was Philo's approach, and that stems really well with the Christian approach to scripture. So that's why they preserved Philo, even though the Jews didn't. We talked about this, I think, a little more in the Shir Hashirim series, which I would refer you to. Philo's not going to come up too much for us over here. I guess because we're in the 3 weeks, there's some fun historical facts. Philo's family was super interesting. I would tell you to go research Bernice and Tiberius Julius Alexander. Rabbi David Katz has a great podcast on Tiberius Julius Alexander and the role that he played in the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Both of them are relatives of Philo. Um, the next source for information for us is going to be Josephus. So I'll stake a claim on this one a little bit, even though I don't really know what I'm talking about. But essentially, Josephus does not mention Jesus. That's much weirder because Josephus is a historian. So Josephus is writing in the 1st century of the Common Era. He is a Jew who was captured by Rome during the um, war that culminates with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and he writes lots, but he writes the Jewish history for Rome. Um, there are maybe a few passing references which scholars are going to argue about. Did Christians interpolate those later as a cover up? I don't know, probably. Maybe he mentions James, who's Jesus' brother. Yes, Jesus has a whole family. Um, but the bottom line is this is where it leads people into this speculation of, was Jesus actually a historical figure or not? We're not going to get into whether Jesus is historically legitimate. That whole debate is outside of our bounds. We did a Jesus in the Talmud series a while back. It's clear that not every reference from Chazal in the Gemara that mentions Yeshu was to the same dude, because chronologically it doesn't work out. Um, Yoshua ben Prachia and Nitan Har Bailey, who are two of the Zugos, and one of them is the teacher of Jesus. They lived well before the 1st century of the Common Era, so that chronology doesn't necessarily match up. Maybe there's more than one Yeshu. We're not going to get too far down that field. Um, I just want to get through our sources. So the next source for us that I think is a really critical source is the Roman historian Tacitus. He definitely discusses the Christians, if not Jesus himself. Talks about the crucifixion. Um, Tacitus is writing, let's say, circa the year 115 of the Common Era, and it seems that at that point you could differentiate between Jews and the followers of Jesus, because the latter are the ones who are being singled out for torture and death. Basically, Nero needed to get the heat off of him, you'll excuse the pun, for burning Rome. So he turns to the easy scapegoats, the Christians. And so that's what Tacitus is documenting. There are other Roman accounts of early Christianity, including Suetonius and Mara bar Serapion. I don't know enough to get into that much depth, but Tacitus is definitely going to help us. Another source for our information at the time are the Gospels, some of which can be traced to the first century of the Common Era. Um, it's important to understand. So we talked about the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Gospels are not um, are not first-hand accounts, meaning not a single apostolic gospel can be positively attributed to the disciple that it's referencing. So Matthew didn't write Matthew. Mark didn't write Mark. It was written secondhand. So everything in the Christian Testament regarding Jesus is at least secondhand. There is, just to point out one verse from John to show you how kind of out of bounds it is. Um, so scholars date this as being written around the year 100. John 1:14 has that Jesus was made flesh. So this is pretty obviously kfira and was likely not part of the Jesus's message. I would definitely not drink the wine of anyone who believed that idea that Jesus is God become flesh. It's not clear to me. This is kind of a precursor to the whole communion um, ritual. It's not clear to me that that line was even taken seriously or literally, at least not initially, although it is for sure today. There's the Eucharist and whatever. That's all part of a ritual today. There's other Christian writings, such as Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. Again, these names, Trypho is Tarphon. Whether or not it's Rebbe Tarphon, we can try to explore next time. That dates to the mid second century of the Common Era. Then we have a bunch of Tanaitic material. So, what does that include? The Mishnah and the Tosefta. Megillus Tinus would also fit in there, but timing wise, it doesn't really quite reference Christianity at all, although maybe it does. We can talk about that um, also a little bit next time. But obviously, the Gemara too talks about Christianity. We're going to have some interesting problems with that in terms of censorship and the fact that the Talmud is composed much later. Just to again orient us. So we're talking about the the time period, the first and second century of the Common Era, is when the Tanoim lived. The Mishnah was written around the year 200, the Tosefta by Rabbi Chia, let's say 250, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud that was written in the land of Eretz Yisrael, is, let's say, the year 350, and the Talmud Bavli is sealed Ravina Ravashi or Sof Hora. That doesn't mean that's when the Talmud was published, but the Talmud, let's say, is published between the year 5 and 600 of the Common Era. Maybe there was some tinkering with it a little bit after that. We're going to ignore as unreliable a letter from Pliny that's dated to the year 112 of the Common Era, because now scholars are kind of questioning the historicity there. That would show the parting of the ways had really completed in the eyes of Rome by that date. Okay, so again, let's just refine our problem a little bit. Does the halacha recognize at any time from the year 1 or whenever Jesus was born, more likely the year 6 before the Common Era, and certainly not on the 25th of December, does the halacha recognize any time from the birth of Jesus to the year, let's say, 350 of the Common Era, a point of demarcation between standard Judaism and a new religion called Christianity? And if so, what is that point and how is it demarcated? Why does that matter? Well, can you marry their children? What happens if they touch your wine? Do they count for a minyan? In other words, was there a date in time when Yankee, who believed in Jesus and was a kosher Jew on day 1, was suddenly on day 2 a guy the next, right? If not, how did it work? Let's make it a little messy and concoct a scenario to make things even more halachically murky. You've got Judea in the year 59 of the Common Era, and someone who keeps mitzvos, they go to shul, but they also believe that Jesus was the Messiah and that he may or may not return. And he's married to this woman who believes that the kingdom of God has come or whatever to all men, and they have a kid. Is that kid at the age of 3, after they touch your wine, is your wine kosher, right? That's essentially what we're trying to parse out. And that's going to take us to whether or not we postle based on belief. And we will leave that for next time. Thanks so much for joining.
This is the end, beautiful friend. Thank you for joining us on our journey of learning, and I hope you will tune in for another episode soon, Mirz Hashem. Be well.